There we go. Jenny Erickson, and she's going to be discussing liminal innovations, which I thought was really interesting. So go ahead, Jenny.
Thank you so much. So I want firstly to thank you sincerely, Professor Hassan, and also the other editors, Schultz, Reward, and Wilcox, for this possibility. It's a great workshop so far, and I'm happy that we can present our work. And this is work together with me and my colleagues, Professors Mats Sedenius and Professor Per Ågerfalk from Uppsala University. So today I will actually take the opportunity to try to give a brief presentation of the underlying conceptualization of our model, the SIRE model, which is a model of social interaction and resourceful agency in new technology enactment. And we use this to model how and why liminality in encountered tensions bring about reconfigurations. So what I will do is that I will do my best to illustrate this for the audience who have not read the abstract via one first illustration, and later run through one of the vignettes from the ethnographical case study that we have confronted our model with as part of the process of theorizing. So Olechowski and Scott from 2021 take the COVID-19 pandemic, and they offer a conceptual insights on why and how different tensions leads to organizational shifts that results from emerging practices and a broader transformation process concerning digital work. And these generative shifts in practice offer possibilities for materializing new ways of doing things concerning digital work. So Olechowski and Scott further call for research that examine more deeply this liminal process of iterative experimentation and implementation, and to articulate how and when these novel, alternative, or even revised materializations generate opportunities for creative change in crisis, and also in what ways these can be enabled and supported over time. So liminal innovation, as defined by Mertens, is a set of practices that entail a seemingly never-ending transitional phase, where one innovation serves as a building block or as a kickstarter for another one, and they flow repeatedly between experimentation and implementation, being enacted in ongoing practices where partial implementation is just a condition for experimentation. So by the insight that all liminal situations, the temporary dissolution of established expectations, norms, and processes, which offers new possibilities for organizing as the participants experiment with alternative ways of structuring regarding their activities, or even invent new ones with digital technology. They do not happen solely in large-scale settings due to major events or natural catastrophes, or for that matter, solely via emerging technologies, as a plethora of digital technology and its applications are vastly heterogeneous and to the majority embedded into everyday life. So we broaden this inquiry by the concepts of constitutive rules and anchoring practices to model the three tensions: pragmatic, tactical, and existential of liminal innovation. So to give a first illustration to set the stage for this model, how and why liminality in encountered tensions could bring about reconfigurations. This is an example of how a local farmer in Sweden, through this experimentation, has introduced a Swedish digital payment method to donate to charity for child cancer. The farmer has land that needs to be in crop rotation, and after some experimenting, growing sunflowers and selling some directly to passers-by is actually difficult in a rural setting. So this was arranged as a do-it-yourself, and the farmer realized that this could simplify both for the customers and themselves to take part in this donation. So it means that people use their mobile phones and the application called Swish to send money from all over, and even not from other places than this local origin. They actually, as he says, they ask us to send the flowers to schools or caring institutions, and then they swish the money to us. So how and why, what was it that caused this practice to form in relation to this particular technology, and not by means of money or other applications? Well, we, like the anthropologist Roy de Andrade, draw on the work of John Searle to introduce the term constitutive rule to describe a particular kind of culture, or should we say cultural act, that defines what should count as what. So this is what we do when we model how and why liminality and encountered tensions bring about reconfigurations. We can say that practice lies behind every aspect of level of social causation. So even though we see practice as routine activities rather than consciously chosen actions, if you look at Bourdieu, therefore a practice is a public ritual rather than a habitus, and it anchors and in some sense reproduces a larger set of constitutive rules and their attendant discourses. So it encodes the dominant schema as a pattern of action that people enact without explicitly describing the inherent nature of the work life it creates, and the reason being that it embodies the constitutive rule it creates. So the many practices, and also that it enacts and also constitute this constitutive rule of switching as payment, can be seen in this example of the local harvest festival, which is situated close to this farmer. It celebrates locally produces and handcraft, and among all these locally produced things and food, it's carefully crafted by means of traditions. The digital payment via phone swish was a common practice by all of the almost 200 exhibitors. So as Sewell argues, the structures are themselves constituted by culture, and both the content and the domain of culture are constituted through a set of undeniably material practices. So Sewell follows Giddens when he sees structures as dual. They are both the medium and the outcome of the practices which constitute social systems. Structure becomes enacted through cultural schemas, where schemas, just like Giddens says, are virtual and generalizable procedures that are applicable in or extended to a variety of contexts of interaction. Even though culture is a form of structured practice, it doesn't say much still about how particular practices are reconfigured, especially as some of these practices clearly are resisting change. And that's why we turn to Swidler, who continues some practice anchor and control or organize others. These structures and their associated practices are deeper, even more fundamental and more powerful than others, if you look at it in a Sewellian sense. So more fundamental, more enduring, more pervasive and influential in shaping and constraining action. And these rules are anchored as the larger rules of the system are reproduced not by people directly knowing those rules, but by people acting strategically in a world that presume those rules and fits this situation well. So therefore, the tensions resulted in a reconfiguration that for the farmer, via pragmatical tensions was explored, reconfigured to innovation for the benefit of cancer research, who are targets of the switch, but reproduced also by these exhibitors. Excuse me. So, but why did this particular technology create such reconfiguration in the first place? And why is it not utilized in another farmers market that was taking place about the same time on the mainland? Well, echoed by Mertens, we, just as Olikovsky and Iacono, focus on particular materializations and their meaning, existence, and outcomes in terms of practices. We posit that the moment a technology or its application exists, it creates new choices that were not there before and therefore can no longer be ignored. So once the choice architecture has been changed, even merely ignoring the technology and disregarding its effect is a choice. So in these particular innovation practices, the new choices are emerging within the environment where they will ultimately matter. So the fact that users find themselves in this liminal space cause ambiguous responses to these choices. So explained by Sewell, it is schemas that make resources meaningful as resources. Sewell's example is what makes a Hudson Bay blanket a source of chiefly power for the Quakerdoodle rather than a means of just keeping warm. But on resources, Sewell departs from Giddens as he sees resources as actual because they cannot, the schema alone cannot determine how much of the resource one can lay hold of. And the schema alone will not bring those into being. So schemas are the effects of resources, just as resources are the effects of schemas, as they inculcate and justify the schemas. So resources can be read like text to recover the cultural schemas they instantiate, and sets of schemas and resources may probably be said to constitute structures only when they mutually imply and sustain each other over time. So Sewell argues that this revised conception of how structures are formed from schemas and resources allows a substantive account of human agency. Because structures are multiple and intersecting, and because schemas can be generalized to new situations, and sometimes they can generate unpredictable resource outcomes. And most importantly, because the schemas that are implicit in arrays of resources can be read in multiple and sometimes competing ways, we find that transformation as well as continuity of structures are possible. So the focus for our continued inquiry are the materializations and the particular configurations. As Mertens say, technology is generative of new choices and will ultimately matter. Users finding themselves in this liminal space cause ambitious responses to these choices. So these backgrounds are adaptively developed initial model in step 1 of our research design as an interim at theorizing via inquiry as discursive practice. We have abduced a model of social interaction and resourceful agency in new technology enactment by which we model the liminality encountered tensions. So in step 2, we empirically confronted this model by means of an ethnographic case study. And here we used the traditional work practices of a board in a municipal corporation in Sweden as the object of our study. This was deemed suitable as to study culture in this context of practices, then becomes to observe closely those publicly accessible practices conferred to Norsetina or Sicorel. So access to the deep knowledge of the work practices, generalizable to a larger class of issues that most of us may be confronted by in every day. This is the empirical confrontation we found support for the model. So in the final step 3, if there is such a thing as a final step, the SIRE model, our product of theorizing, was refined and applied to the 3 types of tensions for liminal innovation of Olikovsky and Scott. And they are intended to offer means for describing the changes that will lead to liminal innovation or change. So here we present 3 vignettes from the ethnographic case study to illustrate this particular stance.
Jenny, you have about 2 minutes left.
Yeah, I will then skip this one, and then I will say that in this way, so we may not only think of digital artifacts in terms of bundles of features that are situated in a social context, but as relations that operate as enactments of constitutive rules, acquiring the power to structure related discourses and patterns of activity just because they implicitly define the basic entities or agents in the relevant domain of social action. So as summarized in the SIRE model, seemingly small changes in practices via small subtle changes in rudimentary action sparked the generation of a new practice that could lead to reorganizing, which entailed consequences also for extensive qualities of the organization. So we refer to such disruptive materializations as the overriding of constitutive rules. Such overriding represents materialization that creates a virtual schema with the potential of altering current structures and establishing new anchoring practices interpreted as liminal innovation. So claiming that specifics of materializations impact the meaning, existence, and outcomes of practices, and thus warrants further attention, in particular in information systems research. Our product of theorizing, the SIRE model, makes the relationships of social interaction and resourceful agency in new technology enactment explicit. The empirical confrontation broadens this investigation of liminality to a general setting where new materializations disrupt established practice. And this article that we hope to be able to publish shows the need for responsible innovation research to recognize liminality also in the small and subtle changes of rudimentary practices in the context of their circuits of reproduction, where we see that even minor reconfigurations of our work worlds may lead to openings for liminal innovation or even consequences for ostensive qualities of organizations. So by that, I thank you very much for your kind attention, and I look forward to your questions.
All right, if you can unshare, Jenny, and Katja will be coming on next. Katja, are you there?
Thank you very much. I will also share. So I think you can see my screen.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so First of all, thank you very much for your nice presentation. It was very interesting for me to review your paper, and I learned a lot about your specific field of research. And I would like to start by just summarizing what I think you did great in your paper. So first, the analysis and the abstraction of the tension that arises during or due to the entangling of social and material components in the orchestration of digital practice. I think you focus on a really relevant and also important topic, since digitalization is such a multifaceted phenomenon, and especially the social component is highly relevant. And then also you introduce a relatively unknown empirical method in IS, or at least it was for me at that point. So the ethnographical case study, which I really liked. And of course, the development of your SIRE model that describes social interaction and resourceful agency in new technology enactment. And therefore, I think, well, in my humble opinion, that your paper is well suited for submitting to this special issue, because you develop a very interesting product of theorizing here. But I also listed some points that, wait, it doesn't work. Yeah. Some points that came into my mind when I was reading your paper that you maybe could think of when you revise it. I think you could maybe strengthen a bit the theorizing part that is based on the interviewee's statements. So the interviews were definitely highly interesting and valuable, but sometimes I did not fully understand how you developed the product of theorizing based on those statements. And further, maybe you could describe the method of the ethnographical case study a bit more. So why did you use it in this context, and why is it better than conducting like normal interviews? And furthermore, I thought that maybe a conceptual approach of the main concepts that you use, because you introduce, for me, well, I thought there are many different concepts, and sometimes I thought a conceptual approach, maybe with a figure, could help for the reader to get an overview of your contribution. Lastly, you could think of further elaborating the IS or the IT focus of the theorizing product, because I think right now it is strongly focusing on the social part, which is definitely important, but I think the digital and the IT part could be highlighted a bit more. But yeah, to sum it up, you did a great work, and I really liked reading it. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Katja. So you want me to respond, Nick, or
yeah,
should I?
Go ahead. Yeah, do you want to go ahead and respond to Katja's comments briefly?
Yes.
Then we can open it up for Q&A.
Okay, first of all, thank you so much, Katja, because I also read your written comments and I think it was very helpful. So thank you for that. And as you see, I would try to, in my presentation, give at least a little bit of the conceptual underpinnings. And the problem is that we've been balancing on the rim to make the model understandable, and then providing a lot of well, empirical material that we have used to confront the model. So I would like to say that we are not really using the empirical case study as means for the actual development, rather than that we actually subject the model to a sort of empirical testing. And the reason why is that we think that we decided to go on this kind of more ethnographic approach is because we see that there is support in literature, among other by SIGPHIL, that if we want to have deep knowledge about these phenomena, we should do a study that is more of an ethnographic case. So this is one of the reasons why we decided to. I can understand that the the extended abstract feels loop-sided in terms of the underlying conceptualizations, and as well as providing a lot of a bit superfluous empirical material. But I think this will be remedied in the final version. So thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. Let's open up for Q&A. We have a few minutes for anyone to ask questions about the paper, or the presentation rather. Okay, while people are thinking and mulling over, let me just put in my quick comment, and I think Jenny already mentioned this in her response. Remember that this special issue, essentially, if you were to divide and submissions into empirical versus theory papers, then this special issue is leaning towards the theory paper kind of submission that we're looking for. So if your paper does have plenty of empirical content, then you need to judiciously look at what you want to include in the paper. You might not want to spend too many pages on the empirical content, because that's not going to help your case as far as the products of theorizing, because we are theorizing. So that's one very important aspect. I think a lot of authors kind of missed out when they were submitting their work in progress. So we're looking at the ability and the skill of authors in theorizing their particular chosen product, which takes me to a second comment. And this is something that I think Rudy wrote very nice, and I recommend highly if you have not read Rudy Hersheim's How to Review a Conceptual Paper piece. I think it was in GIS, I forget which one. But I go to that article from Rudy Hersheim and read up how to review, and of course, by extension, write a conceptual paper. If you can satisfy the requirements that Rudy put down there in his way of reviewing conceptual paper, you're right on track there. So what was I going to say there? I guess what I'm trying to say is that we're looking at how authors can argue, convincingly that their product of theorizing is useful and productive for other researchers who's doing or researching that topic. So very important when you're submitting your articles to the special issue. Does anybody else have any questions for Jenny or for Katja, or a general comment? We have about 2 minutes before we pass on to the next presenter. We see Ellen Lee there. Ellen, any thoughts so far?
If I may, maybe I can just say thank you for this useful advice, and definitely it's always this trade-off, how to explain and illustrate the work that you've been doing, the conceptualizations and the model, and to actually present the theorizing in its essence. So maybe this was also a little bit, as I was saying, superfluous attempt to make sure that it was understood. So thank you so much for the advice.
All right. Since we don't have any other questions, I'm just going to go ahead and proceed with the next one in line. So whenever you're ready, please share your screen, or if you don't need the slide, that's fine too.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Wafa, are you online? Yep. Perfect.
Right,
okay.
Take it away.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, good evening for the European, and good night for Emmanuel. Wafa and myself are really glad to be here at the SIGPHIL workshop to present this work in progress on time in longitudinal information system research. Oh, okay, can you see the screen shared properly? Sorry, I got okay. Well, it's a bad pun to introduce the topic, but we thought it was about time to open the black box of temporality. And in fact, the issue is that this topic has been discussed in length in philosophy, in physics, but always thinking about space-time relationship and space-time boundaries. And when we talk about time in management and IS research, it originates from this famous controversy, the Clark-Newton-Leibniz controversy on time, with one side, one perception of time, the absolute time, the Clark-Newton view of time being composed of instants, and time as something that exists independently from objects that occupy the space-time. So the focus on structure, and on the other side, the Leibnizian perspective on time and space and time as a positional quality attached to an object, and where all the objects are independent, as they exist independently from objects, and objects are considered as relative to each other. So the focus on relationship and relation, and or the issue is that, well, most of the literature later on in management does not differentiate really space and time, taking them together. And when they were differentiating and when they were using the time, discussing about time, management and IS scholars mostly use a Newtonian perception of time, the arrow of time, the linear order of time, sequence of events. And even if longitudinal studies in IS and management may use may follow I don't know, complex and dynamic processes across time, or just doing snapshots, most of the time they just overlook and they don't care about the theoretical basics of time, the theoretical foundation of time. And well, we know why. It's because there are plenty of inconsistencies with the temporality literature. There is a lack of an overarching temporal framework, as highlighted by O'Connor. And well, this is the reason why time is under-researched. Another reason may be the fact that we don't have a primary theory on temporality and no collective theory accepted. And the consequence is that, well, most researchers are just cherry picking the single temporal characteristics they want to use in their longitudinal study. So there is a need for more explicit theoretical treatment of time, and we need to go beyond simply accounting for time as part of the context. So our research, or the intent of this work in progress, is to provide a theoretical understanding of the mechanism by which time perception affects research outcomes. And focusing on information system research, well, time and information systems have a long history together, and we can root it to Lee's seminal paper, which was among the first to frame the dimension of temporality related to IT business processes. And Lee sets out, he formalized 6 constructs: temporal location, duration, sequences, deadlines, cycles, rhythm, to demonstrate the role played by IT in introducing temporal changes in organization and in work patterns. And later on, of course, information system research emphasized the role played by time. I mean, we were talking about big data, data velocity, more and more about real time, and even project management methodology, such as the agile method, which intend to deliver quickly and to adapt to change rapidly, so where time time is the imperative. So I'm not going to read my slide, but I wanted to say that, well, most information systems research, it focused on clock time as the main perception of time. It focused on work and productivity as the main experience of time. And finally, the cherry picking I was just mentioning is that it focuses on how technologies affect specific time variables. So this hints us toward the gap that IS research neglected the complexity of the concept of time, and highlight also the gap we are trying to reply, the focus of this paper on actors' experience, relationship to time, and engagement with time.
Thank you, Jean-Loup. I will follow up with the literature review. We kept up in mind different dimensions for mechanical perspective of time and the social perspective of time. For example, temporal segmentation is fragmented with the time units for chronos, while the segmentation is eventual for the kairos. The researcher is stepping away from his own field in mechanical time, while he is in reflective analysis for social time. For chronos, the actor is apparently in the data, while the perception of the actor is the key element in kairos. The chronos rhythm is linear. The kairos rhythm is non-repetitive. And finally, the time work organization is monochronic in chronos and polychronic in kairos. Jean-Loup. To better understand how time was framed in IS research, we examined the IS literature in 2 steps. The first one was a meta-analysis. The second one was a descriptive review. We selected the articles published between 2001 and 2020 in the basket of IT journals. Data analysis was performed using a combined quantitative approach, an ascending hierarchical classification, and factorial analysis of correspondence. The key square value observed was more significant than the critical p-square value. The p-value was less than a significant level alpha, indicating the correspondence between the classes we generated and the sub-themes. We observe that the 4 classes are proportionally symmetrical to the benchmark. Therefore, we conclude that the horizontal axis is the methodological approach. On the left, we have the quantitative approach. On the right, we have ethnography. The vertical axis is the perception of time. Mechanical perception is located in the top, while social perception is located at the bottom. Our motivation for this paper was to point out that there is a link between the perception of time, chosen methodological approach, and the theory mobilized in longitudinal studies carried out in information system. This article provides the first explanation for theory's construction based on time. It can guide research towards theoretical framework that can form the foundation of their research according to their perception of time and research methodology. It seems that the social perception of time, kairos, is more appropriate for theory focusing in the actor. In contrast, the mechanical perception of time is more suitable for macro analysis of system. So it's I passed. It's okay.
Okay. Well, so sorry. The main our main theoretical contribution is this integrated framework. I'm sorry, the understanding, sorry, of our perception of time influence methodological choices, and we intend to. Well, there are several work in progress contribution, but we first contribute by deconstructing time. In fact, past research mostly just ignore the complexity of time or tended to subordinate the temporal to the spatial. So trying to map or trying to spatialize time. So we are trying to open this black box of time. And this, as a product of this work in progress, we can think of a question or a new inquiry. For instance, whether different interpretation of time may how they can generate mismatch, over reliance on kairos, under reliance on chronos, and questions such as how can IS methodologies be adapted to account for mismatch, different interpretation, or a balance, an equilibrium between kairos and chronos. In terms of exploratory contribution, we were also thinking of time as a product of research practice, meaning time as realized through researchers' recurring practices that reproduce temporalities and related experiences. So time, a multidimensional, holistic and complex concept. And to wrap up this presentation, I will say that we, and moving forward, so next steps, we intend to refine and formalize the two constructs of chronos and kairos. And as a way to help future information system research to be more specific, more explicit with regard to time, and most importantly, the assumption being made about time. And we believe this may be an interesting insight for longitudinal studies in diffusion of innovation, adoption, digital transformation, agility. So this work in progress presents this initial effort to improve our understanding of time, temporal assumptions in IS research, and all the influence methodological choices. Thank you. And well, I think we have plenty of time for the discussion.
Thank you, Jean-Luc. Thank you, Wafa. That was great staying in time there. So we have Steffi, who's your discussant. So if you could unshare your screen, okay, and we can let Steffi step in.
Yes, one moment. I will try to share my screen as well. So I hope you can see my 1 or 2 slides that I will share. First of all, thank you very much, Jean-Luc and Wafa, for your for the opportunity that I can discuss your research and for the presentation. I really like that you advanced it already compared to the paper that I got to review. And the best thing or the most intriguing thing about the paper is that I really was, it was a very intriguing question for myself to think about if researchers' perception of time is a product of theorizing. And actually, so I first realized that probably there are different dimensions of time. So I think there is literature out there that in the IS field, for instance, that discusses how researchers can incorporate time in their theory or theorizing process. So time influences or theories might depending on time, and they would also change over time. So, but I realize this is different from what you are looking at, this time dimension. So you really look at researchers' perception of time. So kind of something that is, a capability of the researcher. And you argue that this also influences the methodological choice. And so the theorizing, it should be incorporated in IS research or in the theorizing process. And time was not part of the products that Nick discussed in his introduction today, and also not in the editorial, but I found kind of his definition in the editorial, kind of what is a product of theorizing. So it's a pre-theoretical conceptual artifact that informs practice and imagination of academics and has a major implication for research and theory. And so I would say, yes, kind of time or the researcher's perception of time kind of influences imagination of academics, just like any perception of researchers or any capability and any experiences. So I think, yes, it's definitely a product of theorizing, or maybe a product of theory, in my opinion. And I think it would be nice to have a discussion of this time as product of theorizing in the paper as well. But you already included some of this discussion in the presentation now. I was also wondering, how you in this literature review actually identified this perception of time of the researchers, because you say that it's an a priori concept of researchers. So they first have this perception of time and then they choose the method. So I was wondering how you did identify this perception in a review, and if whether a literature review is the right method to actually show this this argument that you want to show, if this is a good method for it. But I think you had this a very interesting conceptualization between the mechanical and sociocultural perspective or perception of time. And you basically argue that generally those two perceptions coincide with the epistemological assumptions of interpretivism and positivism. And I guess, because there were so many details in the research in progress paper, that you have chosen those different perceptions of time based on the epistemological perspective of the articles. Then I found the insights that researchers who take a social or mechanical perspective tend to use an ethnographic or quantitative method a little bit, not surprising, or even a little bit tautological if we think that interpretism usually uses some qualitative methods, and positivism tends to use quantitative methods. So I think it's not, at least not as surprising. And my final comment would be that I was also wondering how this spectrum of the methodological approach, so it was the ethnographic studies on the one side and the quantitative studies on the other side, and in between was mixed method. So I was wondering how you come up with those approach or the spectrum, because I think what I'm kind of missing, I was wondering how other studies that use interpretivism, kind of like other methods, kind of like case studies or action research or something like that, how do those methods appear on this spectrum? So these are my comments to the paper. Thanks.
Thank you, Steffi. Very good comments. Let me go on and open it up for Q&A. I'm expecting some interesting questions. We have hands up from Leslie. Yeah, Leslie.
I'll go ahead, Nick. What happens when the researchers, using both sense of time, Chronos and Kairos, in the same paper, that can't appear on your framework? So that suggests that the framework is inadequate.
Jean-Luc, Wafa? Did you hear Leslie's comment there, or question, I guess?
Wafa, if
Yeah.
you...
Yeah. Okay, can you repeat the question, please?
What happens if the researcher is using both senses of time? Because one is mechanical time and the other one is literally translated from the Greek timing, the right time. And you're saying that one's mechanical time and one's social time.
Okay, for example,
but I've come across papers, indeed I've done papers. How does your framework account for a researcher that's using both senses of time?
We have examined the section, methodological section for all paper to define if researcher develop ideas for mechanical or social time. For example, if we have research use, for example, months or days to define units of time, it's mechanical time. If they use events to define units of time or steps for project, for example, it's social time.
All right, Leslie, you have a response to that, or shall we?
Well, no, I don't. I don't want to labor the point, but it seems to me that Chronos and Kairos might be on a continuum, and that where researchers are using both senses, then somehow your framework's got to take that into account.
Mm-hmm.
I guess a different way of saying that is, you know, there's this golden rule. I think it's actually McKinsey and Company, mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive as a sort of criterion for good taxonomy. And I guess Leslie is wondering if, you know, one paper or one set of authors could end up in more than one category, or how that could be the case. But, you know, one option is, or, you know, I don't know the details of the paper, could be that, you know, in the way that you measure, it's automatically assigned to a particular category depending on how it is described in the paper. I presume that's what you have done. Which I think is fine, but I guess the question goes to that you might want to add a discussion to the paper. What happens if there are contradictory statements within a paper in terms of how the authors actually conceive subjective versus objective time? Not a question, more comment.
All right. Any other questions? Because if there's none, I like, this is actually a good opportunity for me to add one more comment to, you know, generally to everyone, to everyone that's interested in submitting. As if you read Rudy Hersheim's How to Write a Conceptual Paper piece, one of the most important things that he noted in his paper is that he says, if you're writing conceptual paper, your concept that you're trying to elaborate on must be in the introduction. Meaning that the introduction should start with saying, here's the product of theorizing, and this is what we're trying to do. And if you don't have that in your introduction, that means you've just missed a big step there. Simply because the goal, again, is to theorize on this product, theorizing, right? So it has to be in the introduction. So on that point, one of the things, and I'm thinking, I understand why, roughly what you're trying to do here in terms of, you know, including time, therefore it will change perhaps the methods that you're doing research and all that. I wonder if you can step back a little bit and maybe take on a bigger picture of what you're trying to do here. And what I'm trying to say here is this, what you've done really here is you are examining time using two paradigms. So, you know, the paradigm of time as chronos and the paradigm of time as kairos, for example, right? And obviously, you know, when you're talking about changing paradigms or shifting paradigms. The best example of this is like, Einstein's relativity theory, So suddenly time is relative, right? So it blows your mind, right? So it changes the paradigm for how you view time. So let me give you an example of how media richness theory uses a paradigm. So when this is an old theory, obviously, right? Media richness. But what they did was when they started the research, they were using, in order to study how managers communicate with each other, they started by using the communications paradigm, meaning that in order to theorize how managers communicate, they went to the communications field and looked at how the communications paradigm worked on it. They discovered after doing that it might not fit what they're trying to accomplish in the IS field. So they ended up shifting to the information processing paradigm, which is a totally different view of what managers communication is. Okay? So what I'm trying to suggest here to you is that rather than limiting your paper to, yeah, time is important, here's why taking time into consideration will force us to change how we research our phenomenon. I wonder if you can step back and say, hey, time is a big deal in information systems. How can we theorize about time? What paradigms can we look at that has research time? And maybe we can get inspired by those paradigms in order for us to research how we should include time in IS, which is a little different from what you're trying to do. Do you get what I mean? In terms of, so I just leave it at that because we need to get to the next paper. But thank you again for your interesting presentation, and we look forward to your submission. All right, we have next, just before we see Daniel do his introduction to the Journal of Information Technology, we have Axel, who's going to be presenting on digital innovation governance. Axel, are you there?
Yes, I'm there.
All right.
1 second, I'll try to share my screen. Hope all of you can see it.
Yes.
Wonderful, great. Yeah, hello together. My name is Axel Hund, and first of all, thank you for the opportunity to present here our work in process paper. As you can see, the title of the paper is intended to be Digital Innovation Governance, and we try to develop a perspectival theory and a research agenda down the line. Just to 1 second, there we go. Our paper started basically with the idea, what is good governance in times of almost ubiquitous digital technology? What does it mean? And also the label digital, is there anything different to the label IT that we have been using traditionally? As a quick definition, IT governance on a very high level can be thought of as focusing on the definition of responsibilities. So who is actually doing what, who has to do what, and also decision rights, meaning who gets to decide what. And it is implemented typically through the application of different types of mechanisms. There are 3 different types of mechanisms on a higher level, which are structural, processual, and relational. And while IT governance was initially only focused on the computing in a circle, which basically meant people with access to the IT department that had the rights to actually work with IT artifacts, etc. Nowadays, I think, as all of us can attest, we all have access to different IT artifacts. We use digital technology every day in most circumstances of our life. This actually forces IT governance to take a broader picture and also to rethink certain aspects that have been established until now. So the aim of this paper is to first address the prefix digital, or following up, which is frequently appended to existing concepts, such as including innovation, transformation, entrepreneurship, and the list goes on. And that is done to typically highlight that there is something different. Most papers don't really put their finger on what is actually different, why we're suddenly talking about digital technology rather than IT. but there seems to be a dubious ontology. And one interesting thing is that digital innovation appears to oftentimes cause tensions, especially in the context of organizations that need to make the switch from established routines, processes, structures towards something that is a bit different and more in line with the logics that are needed to produce digital innovation, for example. Here you can think of those tensions as something that has like two poles, so to speak, and the changes necessary to pursue digital innovation are opposed to the existing logics and routines that keep the organization afloat. So while you need to still produce what you're already doing, where you have a lot of employees that are really good with that, there is the tension or the push towards some new kind of logic. To illustrate that a little bit, I want to refer to the MISQ paper from Svan et al. 2017, and they illustrate 4 specific tensions that are arising. The first tension is focusing, for example, on capabilities. Here you have the tension between existing capabilities, so what people are already capable of doing within the company, and what is in line with the existing structures and processes of the company, and also the eventual product that is sold or service. The other pole here is the required dimension, which is about capabilities that are actually needed to produce new types of digital products. The second tension is focusing on product versus process. Oftentimes, traditionally, products were kind of finished once they were sold to the customer. For example, if a car was fully done and sold, then basically that was it from the company side. Of course, there were some minor offers that were still open, but the product as is was basically done. On the other hand, we nowadays have a lot of products that keep developing even after they are sold to the customer. So for example, modern cars are oftentimes updated overnight while already being with the customer, changing the product in itself, giving a lot of opportunity for generativity. The fourth is, for example, collaboration. Here, a company can focus on the internal dimension, mainly working within internal departments, experts within the company, and so on. Or it can focus on contributing within an innovation network, or pursuing open innovation agendas, and so on. And the last one that Svan et al. Are pointing out is control. Here the question is, how much control do you need to maintain over the product, and how much flexibility do you have to give to even people outside the company to actually benefit from generativity? The problem is, if you maintain too much control, there won't be any opportunity for generativity, or at least it's very strongly diminished. On the other hand, if you increase the flexibility too much, you may end up losing the control over what is in the end creating value, and you as a company can't earn money from that. So there are a lot of aspects in those kind of things that need to be governed, because there are always two poles that you can't basically just get rid of. Like, you can't just focus on one within a company. And the question is, how can they be governed? What we currently have observed within the literature is that we, first of all, we know very little about those pervasive tensions that characterize digital innovation. There's very little research done until now. The second thing is that only a minority of organizations, even up to today, are prepared to face those associated challenges due to the lack of also insights about it. And in that regard, from a purely research-centric perspective, the insights on the governance literature seem to remain rather incomplete and unsystematic. What we want to do is our methodological approach is based on Leitner 2018, a broad theorizing review, where basically the insights from the literature are not informing the gap, so to speak, but rather the theory that we are, or the products of theorizing that we plan to develop. We have, just a quick overview, I'm not going into too much detail here. We have already identified relevant journals, set up certain search strings, and gone through a full forward and research search, which ended up with a certain amount of, a final sample of articles, so to speak, and we have to analyze them. The current state is basically what we are having here. We try to like first of all, reading through all the articles and identifying what kind of mechanisms, governance mechanisms, are actually within the papers related to traditional innovation. So we're not really interested in an overview of general governance mechanisms, but specific governance mechanisms that have been empirically validated already in the context of traditional innovation, and therefore might be also useful to approach the new challenges arising in the context of widespread digitization. Just to give you a little bit more of a feel for it, what we did here, we, for example, focused on structural mechanisms which affect the formally established organizational entities, such as hierarchical levels, etc., within a company. And what we found here is several different types of mechanisms that we grouped them in, which affect, for example, the organizational structure, like decentralized or like flat organizational structures, etc., the leadership structure, team structure and characteristics, reporting line, etc. The processual mechanisms that we found are about affecting the coordination. So we have the structure, so to speak, with the different levels, etc. And we have the processual dimension that helps the coordination and cooperation between those different organizational entities. So you define how they're different from each other, how they have different areas of expertise, etc. Now you need to define how they formally work together through routines, processes, monitoring, and also decision-making. Who's going to decide what? What we found here, there are several governance mechanisms related to leadership style, process flexibility, evaluation, incentives, and so on. Lastly, we found relational mechanisms that are particularly focused on helping different entities within the organization to develop a mutual understanding. I think, like within our field, the IT business alignment, I think, is very well known. It's oftentimes about this here, where it's important that different fields of expertise actually get to know each other a little bit so they can speak roughly the same language. The types of mechanisms that we found until now are organization-wide mechanisms affecting the entire organizations. That could, for example, be something like an informal after-work meeting where all departments are invited, and so on. There are also different mechanisms that are either on between teams or within specific teams. Based on this, what we want to do, we derive some major insights. The first one is on the topic of IT governance, that there are actually mechanisms, governance mechanisms, that are particularly suited for supporting innovation, not just as a general governance mechanism, but particularly for innovation per se. Here we hope to provide a first overview along the lines of the typical threefold dimensions of structural, processual, and relational. The second one is we take a closer look into digital innovation and what challenges are actually, like 4 of them are already introduced as an example, those specific challenges that are arising due to digital innovation. And we want to show how those related traditional innovation, like those mechanisms that have been empirically validated in the context of traditional innovation, are actually applicable to digital innovation. And for example, the 4 competing concerns as introduced by Swan et al. Lastly, and that is the main product of theorizing that we want to develop here, is a framework to think about digital innovation governance. Like, how is it actually different? And how can those, the set of proven governance mechanism be used to, for example, unbalance the status quo? If you have 2 competing poles, and most organizations over time tend to lean more towards, for example, exploitation rather than exploration. So the typical ambidexterity topic. The question is, how can you actually use those mechanisms to slowly unbalance the company without disrupting it, the existing processes and structures that actually earn the company money? But how can you unbalance it more towards a more explorative approach through using those governance mechanisms? And in developing such a theoretical frame and research agenda, we hope to provide a new perspective on the whole concept of what is actually different between digital innovation governance and IT governance. with that, I'm already at the end, and I look forward to your comments and hopefully also some suggestions what best way we actually have to communicate and illustrate and flesh out such a framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Axel. We have Jenny, who's going to be your discussant. So you can unshare your screen. There you go. Go ahead, Jenny.
Okay, so I'll just also share my screen, and let's see now.
Are you okay, Jenny?
Yes.
Okay,
okay, so sorry for that. So I'm really appreciating that I could read this paper, Axel, and I think that you do have setting out with great ambition in this systematic literature review, and I can already see that there are users in this particular abstract that you've submitted, because it's already bearing evidence that this field is very broad, fragmented, and tension-filled, and it has all these several approaches and perspectives for inquiry into information governance. So I think there is already something that you're onto, and that could be useful for researchers. And I'm also very intrigued by the perspectival theory development that you are going about, that suggests that, at least to me, it suggests that there will be causal knowledge on this, and this would be very interesting to explore further, especially if it's put into context of particular materializations or digital technology. So I think there are some work in progress. You could, I think at currently it's very general and broad. So the conceptual framework to tease out the basic foundations and definitions would be helpful. Also for the Swan et al. Paper, which seems to be foundational for your conceptualization. The same goes for the perspectival theory development and the research agenda. Where is it going, and what is going to happen? It's really intriguing. And how does this relate to novelty and nativeness of information systems? I already mentioned the specificity of digital technology, which I think is a cornerstone, especially in times when now we see that digital technologies and its applications are becoming so heterogeneous, so that we will actually have and that type of information will matter, and especially for information systems theorizing. I also ponder that you have reduced successful innovation into these independent mechanisms. So to me, it would be interesting to also learn what are the necessary relations and mechanisms to produce this change, and that would come about as well in the literature study. And not only these contingent relations, because there, as I've been talking about, different mechanisms could clearly result in similar empirical patterns and vice versa. So are they independent? Can they be combined? And if they are to be combined, what would then be the value of this classification? So these are some of the things that I think could be presented in a full version of the paper, but there are also things that I've been pondering a little bit more about, and one of those is that drawing on the literature review of innovation governance as the source for solving challenges of new and emergent digital technologies or digital innovation sounds, I'm not fully convinced of the approach, and one of the reasons is, of course, that you yourself present that digital innovation has have an inherent different take of it. So this is something that I think is of importance that you clarify, at least for the reader. And I think it came about a little bit more in the presentation, how you think about it. So I'm convinced, because I also understand when you discuss Swan et al., that you have insights into actual production processes. And I think that's where this contribution also could lie, to actually focus more on, as you were asking about the framework, maybe focus on 1 or 2 digital innovations, or perhaps even segments of businesses and or production parts of the innovation chain, so that people could actually have something to compare. I'm also a bit curious about the distribution of journals. There's actually only 1 journal from the innovation field, whilst the rest are from within information systems, which I of course think are very good journals. But as you present your literature review as intradisciplinary, then you have to be a bit cautious, so that it's not actually ending up to be intradisciplinary and only be a product for the information systems field, which I think would be a bit sad. Yeah, so these are really the challenges that I see ahead, but I do look forward to the full manuscript, and I especially like the kind of presentations of a review articles that could really help younger scholars to have a good starting point, especially in a field that is so fragmented as innovation governance. Yeah, thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Danny. All right, so let's open up for Q&A. If anybody have any questions to both Axel or Jenny. Leslie has one.
Yeah, very, very quickly. In the literature on innovation, very often it divides into 2 processes. One is exploration and the other one is delivery. And usually they have very different governance mechanisms. I wondered whether you were going to include that in the paper.
We haven't directly addressed that yet in our framework. It is a very good point, though. Like, we were thinking about it more in the context of ambidexterity. I think it's fairly related, at least.
Yeah.
The question is how well it actually maps. One of the key discussing points oftentimes in the digital innovation literature is that exactly that differentiation between process and outcome is becoming increasingly difficult, which
that's an interesting finding, though, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Which, but like, in turn, it would make that kind of difficult to put in the framework. But yeah, like, it's a point we're actually thinking about, and it's a good one.
Any other questions? Oh, by the way, I see Rudy in the list. Rudy Hirsham. I mentioned Rudy's name a few times earlier for his conceptual review paper. So if anybody has any questions for Rudy, I'm sure he'll be happy to answer your questions about his paper as well. So let's open up for Q&A for anybody, for Axel or for Jenny. Any other questions? While that's going on, I was wondering if, just like I mentioned earlier, it's important that the authors spend time and pages on the actual product of theorizing rather than on the actual, literature review and going into what we found in the literature review and all that. I wonder if, other than, I understand that you're trying to build a framework for this, I wonder if focusing on the actual tensions as a concept might be something that's useful, because that's, as you mentioned, is quite under research as a concept in IS. So I don't know if that has struck you at all, because that will allow you to, to break it apart and unpack it and come up with something that no one has ever done. So what do you think about that?
We did think about that, and it will definitely become part of the paper. We're just not certain, like, what will be the main focus, if it's rather on the governance, which we're at the moment leaning towards. But we also see that apparently, especially the the tension paradox area is a very interesting one in that context, obviously.
Okay. All right. Stephen has a question. Stephen, you're muted.
Yeah.
It's a metaphorical kind of issue in relation to these aspects of theorizing, and that is just on the face of it, the idea of innovation governance sounds a little strange to me. And I understand that in organizations, of course, you went through a number of the different processes and so on. But I mean, is there some kind of a paradox between innovation and governance?
That's an interesting question, actually. I think my best try to answer it would be going back to the ambidexterity view of things, where I think, especially when it comes to the exploitation part of innovation, governance would be very easily to be implemented because things can be very clearly fleshed out and planned and defined. Whereas on the exploration part, it's probably difficult to define a clear governance structure that fits everything, because oftentimes you rather want to open up opportunities to explore new things, play around with new affordances, etc., which is probably harder to govern. On the other hand, you can probably, I think, just provide the space for exactly doing that through governance, which is not always possible within the context of an established company that is already like knows exactly when to do what, etc., and you have to stick to what has been done before.
All right, thank you very much, Axel, for your presentation, and Jenny for your comments. Leslie is going to host Daniel Schlagman, who is both of them are actually editors, editor-in-chiefs of the Journal of Information Technology. So, and he's going to be talking about the journal and also especially about the special issue that this workshop is focusing on. So Leslie, take it away.
Thank you very much, Nick. We're giving Nick just a 15-minute rest, in fact. And that time is going to be taken up with Daniel Schlagwein, who's going to talk about the special issue. One piece of news is that the submission date has been moved to March the 1st, 2022. So that's new, and it's a later deadline. Daniel, can you get yourself on screen?
Yes, I'm here. Can you see me?
Yeah.
And I might share a few slides. I realize it has been a 2-hour session, so I think everybody is looking forward to a cold drink or coffee soon. So I keep it short and tight. And thank you so much, Leslie, for introducing me. I'm sort of introducing you back because Leslie is both my co-editor-in-chief of JIT and many years longer than me, I should say, and also one of the special issue editors of this special issues, as people here will know. I just wanted to share a few general points with you about JIT. Not sure how familiar everybody is with the journal. I think you all know it's one of the AIS basket journals, senior scholar journals. The special issue is part of the Journal of Information Technology, so any kind of content related questions, please address Nick and Leslie, which are here. The other special issue editors for this special issue are Ulrike and Susanne, and I'm Daniel Schlagwein from University of Sydney. What is JIT generally interested in, and I think the agreement between us as 2 or 4 editors of the journal is that we're interested in, and I think that's what JIT is widely known for, emerging technologies, the kind of cutting edge development around new technologies. But we would also say that we are interested in future oriented work, thought leadership, normative and value-based claims and analysis that have impacts on practice and policies. And I think that we have been a home for what you could say more unusual left field papers, including a very lively scholarly debates section, which I often hear when I mention JIT. People seem to really enjoy the scholarly debates section, and particularly for the authors of this special issue, many of those debates have been on some version of theory or theorizing or particular elements or underlying paradigms to those theories. So you might want to familiarize yourself with those debates if you are not already familiar with them. In terms of this kind of metrics to JIT, I think we have been tracking well. Our current impact factor is 5.8, long-term 5-year impact factor 9.4. We have been upgraded in the British ranking. That's particular for authors from the UK, relevant from 3 to 4. Together with, I saw Mike Myers and Per Agerbalg in the audience, together with ICIS, which has also been upgraded. So we are very happy that the European journals are getting more recognition in Europe these days. This is any mistakes on a figure, please blame only me, because I prepared that to sort of map how JIT is tracking relative to the other AIS baskets. So this is how our 5-year impact factor has developed compared to the other basket journals. I think collectively we have been doing very well. You see a bit of shift going on. So before we were second to MIS Quarterly, now we are second to JSIS. And I think this is because Clarivate, formerly Thomson Reuters, has actually changed the formula, which seems to have in some way impacted journals differently. MIS Quarterly, obviously not that great. JSIS has been doing very well. For us, it doesn't seem to make that much of a fundamental difference. So just to note, because typically I would discourage authors from putting 2 different formulas to create the values of one graph into the same paper. If you're interested in those things as ratings and rankings and all of this, this is the blue line, is how we have been tracking relative to the other journals included in the basket. Now, specifically to this special issue, as I said, we are always interested in, unusual left field, well-argued, well-developed scholarly work. So a couple of examples, and I believe Nick posted this 1 or 2 years ago. We ultimately decided on the Kuhnian analysis of the digital music revolution by Riemer and Johnston as our paper of the year, but the 2 runner-up papers were also philosophy papers, including one co-authored by Nick. In the current year, in the current issue, in the first issue, we have a debate on the relationship between IS research and the natural sciences. So the very nature of what kind of research IS or what kind of field IS research actually is or should aspire to be. Is it a science? Is it a social science? Should it orient itself towards the humanities? Very interesting debate, I thought, as was our most downloaded paper of this year, the Suzanne Ribat paper on theorizing as a craft. So theorizing not as a science, not as an art, but as a form of craft, and the responses by Benjamin Müller and Alan Lee I also do recommend. And we had many more such works, including, which people might have heard, the theory light debate, the context is king debate. We had papers by Böll et al. On how to use hermeneutics and Gadamer for conducting narrative literature reviews as a sort of antidote to systematic literatures as the only acceptable form. So we have generally been very open, and Leslie and I are both interested with very different perspectives, but generally interested in philosophical and theoretical work. If you want to submit to this special issue, please follow the advice by the special issue editors. So submit according to their deadlines and their timelines. If you need an extension or any kind of special arrangement, that is their decision. So reach out and, from experience, reach out early. If there's any issue, question, special extension needed or whatsoever. Typically, special issues do not have a lot of flexibility in allowing late submission, simply because there is a follow-up timeline which needs to be held, and reviewers need to have time. But again, this is a one-to-one negotiation between author pairs and the special issue editors. When you submit to the system, make sure that you select special issue paper as the submission type, and also mention it clearly in the comments and in the cover letter to make sure that your paper is actually recognized as a submission to the special issue and doesn't go into the pool of regular submissions. And also on that point, please do nominate the corresponding special issue editor, which here, thankfully, Nick Hassan has agreed to take on, nominate him as the senior editor recommended for this paper. This is also another indicator when we look at the 500 or 600 submissions that we're getting per year, to make sure that we assign all of the special issue submissions actually to the special issue editors. To the special issue editors, delighted that you're making the special issue happen. And I wish all the authors good luck. Hope to see some nice papers published in JIT soon from this special issue. And if you had any questions, comments, feedback, points that you wanted me to talk about, and I have not, happy to do that at this point.
Any questions for Nick at this stage, or about the general points about the special issue? We've got about 4 minutes before Nick comes back. No, they all seem relatively happy.
Seem okay. Okay. Good. So I might give it back to you, Leslie, as I thought. This is actually a continuation of work that Leslie and Nick have been doing for some time. There has been a book published.
Okay, I can
Leslie
talk about
Nick
that.
Looked after. Maybe you put it in that context, Leslie.
Yeah, I will. Well, first of all, I've found the phrase product of theorizing difficult to unpack. I suspect lots of people have, judging from the questions we've had about this special issue. But I think it's very important to introduce the concept, because I think that we're at an interesting stage in IS where we really need to start thinking seriously about theorizing and how distinctive theory can arise from the sorts of phenomena that we're investigating, rather than continually borrowing theory and trying to retrofit it. But yes, Nick and I have been planning 3 volumes of a book series for Palgrave Macmillan. The first one's already been published, hasn't it, Nick? And it's a very successful number. Nick was mainly responsible for the hugely amount of work to get all the authors on board and get the thing out. I had the connection with the publisher, and indeed runs a series, Technology, Work and Globalization, for Palgrave Macmillan, and it goes into there. We were lucky enough to get a second contract for this product of theorizing area. So even if you don't make it into the special issue, there is room for developing papers to go into that volume, when it may well be that you might develop those papers for a normal issue of JIT or another journal, indeed. And then there's going to be a third volume, and Nick and I haven't really decided exactly what that's going to be about, but it's really about new theory, isn't it, Nick?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Hopefully we'll have developed.
We might be jumping the gun a little bit, but we'll
yeah,
see.
We're jumping the gun. We're focusing just on product of theorizing.
Right. Well, we'll see. I mean, after we've completed this JIT special issue, we'll know that we have the meat and the what do you call it, the kind of impact that we hope to accomplish. So we'll decide then when the time comes.
Okay. It's a sort of crowdsourcing exercise on
That's right. That's what it is.
theory building for IS.
It is
Okay.
exactly that.
Back to you.
Thank you so much, Leslie, for hosting that session. Thank you, Daniel, for explaining the role of PIT and also our special issue. Let's proceed with Steffi Haag, who is going to be presenting her interesting analogy of using healthy burgers for securing IT systems. So, Steffi, whenever you're ready.
Yes, let me try if I can. So, okay, I think it should work now. Yeah, thanks again for the opportunity to present my research in progress or thinking in progress. It's really in progress. I'm happy for feedback in any kind that it helps me to further develop my ideas. So, yeah, I like actually this those kind of advertisements or food recipes or that show you very delicious burgers and also say that it's good for a good food life and for a great healthy diet. So I think this is really nice for consumers who want to engage in a more healthier diet, that they can, not need to fast, but they can have delicious burgers instead. And actually there are studies that are on healthy eating that found that such food substitutes, they really are helpful for consumers to engage, to encourage a behavior change and to engage in a more healthy diet. And so basically they make it very easy for consumers. So if you think about the IT security context, compared to that, I sometimes got the impression that they do everything to make it very hard for the consumers or the users in this case. So I have just this capture example. So select all images with bridges. And sometimes I'm wondering if it's just me, but so the usual average time to answer capture, it's usually 10 seconds. And I'm not sure if it's really bridges or roads or anything like that. So of course it helps to decide whether I'm human or not, but it also interrupts my workflow. And so, yeah, I was thinking, why could secure systems not be as appealingly designed and marketed as healthy food? And maybe if we would design security more appealing, and maybe it can encourage more users to behave secure, which is actually a challenge right now. We have lots of IT security incidents and still happening. And although we have actually behavioral security research since a very long time, and actually also in behavioral security, analogies of the health context are very common, especially if you think of the protection motivation theory that was originally developed in the health psychology context. So to theorize on health behavior change. And this is one of the most leading theories in behavioral securities to explain how to encourage or motivate a secure the change to a more secure behavior or usage behavior. However, those analogies, at least as far as I know, have never been really, so they were part of as a product of theorizing and were just used without great validation to borrow this protection motivation theory and theorize on secure behavior change. And there are also some first critics, however, that question if it's really effective, this theory, because the main object of study was fear appeal. So basically fear users into the consequences that can occur if they don't behave secure. So it's basically it suggests to make them get worried about and concerned about the consequences that they're facing, and then try to encourage behavior change to a more secure behavior. Yeah, but it was criticized, and so I think there, we need more theories and on novel theories that can help explain secure behavior change in addition to fear abuse, or find other interventions that we can use. And especially I suggest in my research that probably love is a better motivation for behavior change than creating fear. And to encourage people to switch from a less secure to a more secure IT solution, I especially suggest to use this analogy from the food context. So view secure IT systems as if they were healthy food. And especially I suggest that this helps us to reason on the link between secure IT systems and their appeal to users, or their lack of appeal to users. And especially the goal is to evaluate this analogy in my research paper, and I use this methodological evaluation framework for analogies of Katokiwi and his colleagues. And they say that you can evaluate an analogy based on 3 dimensions, so relevance, structural soundness, and factual validity. So relevance is basically that you evaluate the insight the analogy offers and how familiar the audience is with the analogy. Structural soundness is you basically analyze the similarities between both domains that you compare. So here in this case, the security and the health domain. And in terms of factual validity, you finally evaluate how suitable the analogy is for empirical research. And as it's still an research in progress, I haven't got the time to do the factual validity analysis, but I give you some insights about relevance and structural soundness, or my thoughts about this here. Yeah, to assess the relevance of the analogy, that you can see eating healthy food as if it were using secure IT systems. I propose different propositions from examples of eating healthy food, and especially examples that can help us to better explain the relationship between secure IT systems and their appeal to users. And I do this from 2 perspectives. So first from the user perspective, and then also how we can strengthen this relationship based from a provider's perspective. So how can we design secure IT systems that are also appealing to users? And the first proposition that I suggest from the user's perspective is basically that unsecure IT systems are less tailored to user needs than secure IT systems. I'm not sure actually how much time I have left, but I don't think that I have that much time to go into detail. But basically, the idea is that so in tech industry, they have lots of data available nowadays, user data, behavioral data, and attitudinal data, and they analyze those data to increasingly tailor IT to user needs. And so this is actually what Facebook and Co is doing, but and those great tailored IT systems are also form our expectations as users. However, I argue that providers of more secure systems that value privacy have a little bit of a disadvantage here, because they might not have the data access, and if so, it's more expensive and takes more effort for them to really analyze and tailor their systems to user needs. So they have less insight with more effect. So altogether, I would say this, it's harder for secure IT system providers. And actually, we see in the healthy food context that here there are studies that found that people who first experienced artificial flavors and very fast food with lots of fats that are flavor carriers, they actually assess then more healthy food and more natural food as they assessed it as less appealing. And it takes a lot of effort also to make natural food as appealing as healthy food. So this is based on this argumentation also nowadays in the usage context, we have first this great experience from kind of more less secure systems, and then if you want to encourage someone to switch to a more secure solution, it will basically I propose that users will perceive this as less appealing than the secure system, the unsecure system. And on the one hand, or not on the one hand, but users who have a very high ideology when it comes to security, they basically will accept that. But especially I'm focusing on users that do not have strong security motifs. So there's basically also research in healthy eating that shows that users that have not that strong healthy ideologies concerning healthy eating, they tend to also be open to new food substitutes that are more healthier if they are easily available and if they look and taste appealing. So these are studies that found that out, and based on this argumentation, I would propose that also if we can make secure systems easily available and also appealing to users, then we can also help users that don't have, or encourage users that don't have that strong security motifs to more likely change to security systems. And so the question arises, how we can now make those secure systems more appealing to users. And I actually got into research of usable security. This is kind of the intersection between technical security and human-computer interaction. And this usable security field exists more than 25 years. But they still have this, sometimes they call it even a trade-off between usability and security, which I don't think is a trade-off. It can be overcome, but they still find that security developers, they focus just on security because we have lots of emerging technologies and they're struggling to keep up with all those things, and they don't have time and money to focus really on users. So this is why they are still lagging behind, because that's all security first. And in the design teams, there are no security experts. So basically, it's hard to combine both things. So this is something where we can have a good example from the food context. So if you think of Beyond Burger, for instance, this is a plant-based burger, and it's not marketed with that this plant-based burger is healthy, but it's marketed with, it is designed to look, cook, and satisfy like beef. So it's actually designed to make it appealing and to create great experiences. And I think analogically, the IS or security designers can probably better design and market their products such in a way that they are more appealing to users, and then they will also become, this should probably help to motivate more users to use those systems. And
Maybe you have about 2 minutes left.
Okay. So what you can also see is that the functionality that typically security developers focus on substituting the functionality of the less secure systems, but I would suggest to also focus on affordances, to substitute affordances, because they basically describe, so to users should pick up all infos if they look at this technology, so which also includes the experiences and kind of sensory experience, affective experiences. And maybe one final proposition, how you can actually imitate affordances is also something that you can find in the food industry. For instance, Beyond a Burger now supplies for McDonald's, and they work together. And so I also would suggest that unsecure IT providers could open up their platforms for third-party providers that could add more security. And so it will also help users without strong security motives to switch. Well, yeah, 1 minute for the structural soundness. I think, yeah, basically to find some similarities and dissimilarities. I think both domains are about, want to bring about a behavior change in individuals in response or to reduce a threat. And actually the threat is also this, which is different. So both probably threats of the, if you don't change your behavior, are maybe a little bit abstract, but I would suggest they are varying in volatility. So we see also new health risks, like recently with COVID-19, but usually in the technology field now, we have lots of emerging IT, and also with it comes new security risks. And it's hard actually for users to assess this, and actually also assess the relation that changing the behavior reduces the threat. Yeah, in terms of consequences, there's also a difference. So yeah, if you eat healthy, you usually can reduce bodily harm, but security does not, yeah, it does not affect you mentally or physically directly, at least. Of course, you can maybe, it can affect your feelings, or kind of your feeling less ashamed or less fear if you behave more secure, but it basically just has consequences for your data and not for your body in this time of thing. So I think this is actually a dissimilarity. I wouldn't assess that as that critically, more like, and yeah, because this just shows that it's even more important that raising fear might not help in the security context. So I think it kind of even works to further look at this relationship between appealing and technology and secure IT use. Yeah, and finally, another final difference is in terms of experiences in both domains. Experience play a role for consumption. However, yeah, in the eating context, of course, it's a more the taste and the smell of a food, and in the security context, it's more the, yeah, it's not the smell of an IT or the taste, but also affective experiences. And I think, yeah, basically, overall, what's important is that the experiences are positive and exceed expectations. So I think it's not, I wouldn't assess that as critical. Yeah, to conclude, I think I could show that for now that the analogy of eating healthy food supports a relevant and structural sound reasoning about why users without strong security motives perceive security systems less appealing. And I think it can help us to better, this analogy assessment can help us to better theorize on secure behavior change. Okay, it was, I think, a little bit longer, but thank you, Nick, for the patience.
Thank you, Steffi. Thank you so much. When I got, can you unshare? Thank you. So when I received Steffi's abstract, I was like, okay, we got to take a look at this one. It will be interesting to see. So let's hear Etienne. Are you there? Etienne has some comments for you.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Steffi. It was an interesting and original read, and it was stimulating. So in this regard, I think it's a success. I particularly liked the fact that while following this health and security analogy, you chose another route with the food analogy. And this route is, in my opinion, stimulating because you remove all this need to have these theories to transfer risks from the organization to the individual, like in fear appeals or deterrence theory. So I really liked this aspect. as I've shared with you, there are some of your assumptions that I did not agree with, but I think this is particularly interesting because it also stimulated my thinking, and I felt the need to find out how these assumptions could be modified so they would resonate with me. So as I shared with you, the one assumption that instantly felt odd, in my opinion, was this base assumption that healthy means less appealing, sorry, and that unhealthy means tastier. And I reflected a bit on this, and then I found out that it was likely the result of cultural differences in our approach to food. So I looked it up. I went into some food literature, and I found out that actually it seems like the French actually make the opposite assumption. That is, healthy means tastier. And this is where I felt that you could dig further in the analogy by integrating different types of users, as there are different types of eaters, and you could have users who are concerned with security and those who are not. And just like you have eaters who think healthy is tastier and those that think the opposite. And this would allow you to, think of your assumptions depending on the type of user. So I think it's a good way for you to maybe qualify these base assumptions. And similarly, I was not exactly sure that the assumption that unhealthy food precedes healthy food and that people have to change their eating behaviors in this direction only was necessary for your work. It's not the case for me. I think it's not the case in every country, and I think it's not necessary for you to develop this analogy. If you just think of it as a change in behavior that's costly for people, whether it's moving from secure to insecure or from insecure to secure, it doesn't make any difference. So I think you could just simplify it and drop this assumption. And I also had a few questions that maybe could help you further develop your thinking on this. So first, I think you should try to define what exactly secure, insecure, healthy, unhealthy mean. What's a secure behavior? Because I wasn't sure if it's only about switching to a secure system. I think you also include things such as, I don't know, setting a secure password, but does this include changing it regularly? In that case, you could think about, I don't know, keeping this analogy, you could think about maintaining secure practices over time and so on. Lastly, I really liked your reflections on regulation and the analogy between regulating food and security, IT security. And I think you could perhaps explore this further, because you have the potential to use this analogy from the user perspective, the designer perspective, and the regulation perspective. And if you can do this all with the same analogy, I think it could really help people think differently about how to craft security behaviors. So I found this really interesting to see if you had ideas on how to develop this multi-level perspective through your analogy with food.
All right, Etienne, thank you so much. There was a lot of comments for Steffi. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Etienne. Also for your review, I already have those assumptions, and I already told you that it's really intriguing for me and helpful to let me think about the assumptions that I'm writing.
All right. So I'm gonna, Lena has her hand up, so let's go. By the way, I'm going to extend this slightly. We do have a few minutes at the end of our session today. So I think we can, since the discussion is quite lively here, so I think I'll go ahead and extend the time a little bit. So please, the other presenters, please bear in mind that you might present a few minutes later than what was planned. All right, Lena, go ahead.
Awesome, thank you. First of all, Steffi, thank you so much for the presentation. I think it's such a relevant and really applicable topic for a lot of us, right? Because a lot of people are annoyed with this two-step verification approach, and it gets harder and harder to make systems secure. I've got a question with regards to the choice of your product of theorizing. You chose the analogy, right? So that you saw the healthy burger as analogy for secure IT systems. And we had this discussion in our team, kind of the difference between metaphors and analogies, and that the literature around those is a bit inconclusive. So when you first talked about the healthy burger, I thought, oh, perhaps it's rather a metaphor, and the analogies are the ones that you elaborate on, right? The threats and the risks, the consequences and the experiences. So I thought these are kind of the analogies that make up the metaphor of a healthy burger as an IT secure system. So yeah, I just wanted to know what's your stance on this?
That's a very good question. Actually, I think that, a metaphor, I really see it's maybe just a sentence or a word or some words that kind of give you a new picture, a bit of something in your if you talk something and you give a picture of another domain, kind of like that, and an analogy goes further. So I'm kind of really analyzing the complete domain and say that you can compare this, and then you can also use studies in this field. And I'm not sure if this is the same for metaphors. So but I don't know actually the definitional difference right now. I just thought that analogy is more suitable.
Yeah, good point. Because we went through the literature and I thought it's really a bit inconclusive. Some have this definition of analogy, some have the other definition of analogy, and then it's really overlapping, at least from my experience, what I've read so far.
Yes.
All right. Leslie has a question. And I'll respond
yeah, I
to
just
that
wanted to make a comment to reinforce Etienne's point on different types of user. I ran into this problem back in 1987, actually, and developed a matrix which said that there were naive and sophisticated users, and the other dimension, the horizontal axis, was intermittent users and full-time users. And the different types of users require different types of systems or different types of security very often. And so you have to disaggregate, or at least that's what I was doing. You disaggregate the type of user depending upon what the system is.
Right.
Yes.
A quick response to Lana's question, I guess. So the analogy is the rational argument. The argument itself is the analogy, whereas the metaphor is the physical form of that analogy. So yes, it is highly related, but they are quite distinct. So for example, in the case of the thermostat, for example, it takes a physical form, and then there's a whole series of analogies that you can draw from one context to the next. So the analogies are the actual rational arguments that say, okay, well, here are the similarities and here are the differences, and that's why there's something called positive analogy and negative analogies and neutral analogy. So you don't have positive metaphors, negative metaphors, and neutral metaphors. You just have those in analogy. Whereas the metaphor is, there's obviously similarities that it takes the shape of a physical or a linguistic form. So that's the difference between the two.
Awesome. Can I just ask a follow-up? So you would then say the thermostat is like the the physical form, like the metaphor, and then the analogy is kind of like using, for example, the scale and comparing like the scale of the thermostat, so to say, and providing a rationale around this.
So in the case of the thermostat, what was being analogized, the argument there is that there is a cycle that the thermostat controls, right? So the cycling of the levels of heat and temperature is being analogized to the different kinds of cycles that takes place in human behavior. So that's the analogy. So the analogy is drawn from that. The argument is drawn in order to find insights from the metaphor, in other words, because you don't know what it is, right? That's happening. And so you go to the metaphor and say, oh, if this metaphor works, right, maybe with we can find some other things, that interesting things that we did not know otherwise, that we could use in order to describe the phenomenon that we are trying to investigate. So that's how those two differ. So yeah, you apply the analogy, and then you invent or you select a metaphor after applying the argument. So that's how it works.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Okay. Anyway,
Thank you.
so I think we just nice 5 minutes that we used up extra time there. So the next one that we have is Katja, actually. So Katja, whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much. So here we go again. Great. So thank you very much again. Thank you very much, and sorry, hello again. Also again from my side. So I'm thankful and I really appreciate the opportunity to present our research approach today, which is entitled An Information Systems Design Theory for Maturity Models in Complex Domains, which I developed together with my colleagues Elias Pappas and Susanne Straringer. So within the next few minutes, I'll explain to you the concept of maturity models and how we abstracted the development process as a product of theorizing in IS. Maturity models are used for the demonstration and assessment of an anticipated or desired path of improvement or development regarding a delimited subject area. It can be capabilities or processes for defined target group like organizations, companies, or departments. And they basically make use of the assumption that, for example, a company's performance is continuously progressing from an initial state to the state of best maturity or the highest maturity. The mostly linear structure is divided into different levels with factors and indicators which represent the different maturity levels and which need to be met in order to be considered as having reached a specific maturity level. The intention of a maturity model varies from being descriptive and thus merely assessing a current situation of activities or capabilities to being prescriptive and thereby identifying and providing guidance for improvement. So we can say that maturity models are promising tools that offer guidance and assessment in complex domains like, for instance, digital transformation, and show direction and improvement potential for companies. However, there are also limitations. So for instance, often there is missing a description of the actual target group of such a model, which is also the reason why no target-specific structures and characteristics are depicted. And second, the domain focus is often quite broad, which makes it hard to identify and to validate the relevant variables which are representative for the dimensions and the maturity assessment. And furthermore, linear stage maturity models often have a quite rigid structure, and they're based on a deductive literature-based development approaches. And therefore, they often just copy existing maturity model structures, like for instance, 5 stages. So there is a lack of empirical validation of the model's foundations and the factors. And also the intention of the models are dominantly descriptive, and thereby they provide only little or superficial recommendations for improvement, which oversimplifies maturation and which assumes a step-by-step approach to maturation actually. So what was needed at that point was the consideration of complexity, like different sizes of companies, different sectors, and also classes, that maturity models can be more realistic and useful in practice. And one of the most important and decisive drivers for our research was the handling, the investigation, the explanation, and also the explanation of the concept of complexity. And as supportive tool in that concept, in this context, we chose a theory and methods that are capable of investigating and explaining complexity. And this theory is called configurational theory. Its main assumption lies in the its main advantage lies in the simultaneous investigation of the influence, the interconnectedness, the nonlinearity, and the discontinuity of conditions on a predefined outcome. And this is done by applying configurational methods called qualitative comparative analysis, or also necessary condition analysis. It consists of three main assumptions. First, the assumption of conjunctural causation, which describes the investigation of conditions and their influence as conjunctions on the outcome, instead of the analysis of the impact of single conditions separately. And second, the assumption of equifinality, which allows the detection of multiple different pathways leading to an outcome, instead of only, for instance, a linear one. And the third assumption of causal asymmetry describes the concept that the causes leading to the occurrence of the outcome can be different from causes leading to its absence. In our research, we now focused on developing more individualized maturity models by introducing configurational theory and methods into the development process, as those methods are able to derive maturity models that are based on empirical data, and therefore they are afterwards valid for a specific class of companies. And after we had been able to demonstrate that the application of QCA for a maturity model development is possible and also useful, we abstracted this development approach. And therefore, the main contribution of our research approach focuses on the abstraction of a configurational theory-based maturity model for a stronger theoretical and conceptual grounding of the development approach. And it also focused on the generalization of the methods application for maturity model development in general. And we therefore considered maturity models and their development from a design science research perspective. And we divided this development according to Walls et al. Into the main artifacts of a design process and a design product. And furthermore, we abstracted those two artifacts into an information systems design theory, in short ISDT, according to Greger and Jones. And I will now further explain the relationships between those artifacts and the design theory. A maturity model itself can be considered as a design product or as a model artifact. So on an abstract level, a model artifact contains propositions and statements about relationships among constructs, and it explains how things are. So applied to our maturity model context, it is a representation of a company's characteristics, and it provides improvement possibilities. And in order to be able to derive a model artifact, it depends on a method artifact, which provides on an abstract level the set of guidelines which describe its intention as well as problem solutions. Again, on our maturity model context, the maturity model method artifact provides an abstraction of the development procedure of a maturity model artifact, which can be instantiated and will then result in a sector and size-specific maturity model for a defined domain. In the next step, we abstracted the entirety of maturity model components belonging to the method and the model artifact. And this was done in an information systems design theory. And this abstraction on the highest level provides the description of guidelines and components necessary for the creation of further method and model artifacts of the same type. And thus, the ISDT defines the entirety of components for the theoretical and conceptual functionality of a maturity model and its development process. So as main contribution to the body of knowledge in IS, we provide the consideration of maturity models as design science method and model artifacts simultaneously, which are again abstracted as an ISDT. So here below the information systems design theory, you can see the 6 mandatory components of an information systems design theory according to Greger and Jones. And furthermore, here you can see the artifacts, the method artifacts, the model artifacts, which again contain several design principles which provide guidance for future development approaches. And an instantiation of the theory will result in a method and model artifact, which result again in their instantiation in the development process, as well as a sector and size-specific maturity model. So the abstracted ISCT for maturity models in complex domains can be considered as a blueprint for future maturity development by providing theoretical and conceptual grounding, the maturity model concepts, and also a meta framework, as well as design principles for future development. So now I would like to come to my idea for our discussion, which is also in line with the reviewer's opinion towards our paper. So currently we consider maturity models and their development process as 2 separated artifacts that are based on Wars et al. And additionally, we developed an information systems design theory, which was based on Greger and Jones. And when we discussed the fit of our approach to this special issue, we also discussed the positioning of the artifacts according to Hassan et al. And here I also have a question to you, because we were wondering if it is possible that our approach contains 3 elements at the same time, as we have now the model and the method artifact, as well as the theory. So we were wondering if this is possible, that we have a framework, a model, and a concept here, or if we maybe just have a framework which contains the model, but maybe model according to Hassan et al. Would more be of our in our approach would be the combination of the method and the model artifact. So yeah, that was what we were wondering. And I am looking forward to your opinion, of course, towards our research, and also maybe we can discuss these questions. Yeah, so thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Katja. So we have Jean-Luc, who's going to be discussing this paper.
Yes.
So Jean-Luc, go ahead.
Yes, let me just share up my slideshow. Thank you. Yes. Up. Well, thank you for this opportunity to review this interesting work in progress. Overall, yeah, this is really an interesting work, and your paper is really well crafted, well streamlined, and well, clear and relevant arguments. It follows Greger's and Jones' component of information systems design theory and configurational theory as a way to reconnect maturity model with a complex situation and promote the use of configuration and condition for more realistic maturity model. And I share fully your view that this field of maturity model is really important in practice and information system research and deserve more theoretical attention. So I understand also the criticism, I share your view, and criticism of the shortcomings, maturity model shortcomings, oversimplified and constrained view of reality. So overall, the paper raised a really interesting disciplinary question. And from the first review, I found there were room for improvement on the assumption underlying configuration theory. And that's kind of stuff you took into account and discussed in your presentation, and maybe you can build that more in the next iteration of the paper on where the theory comes from and getting back to what generates configuration. I've got my 2 remaining comments. One around the cornerstone of your paper, the Gregor and Jones 2007 ISDT framework. So you follow the 8-component method of Gregor and Jones, and there's still this interrogation about about component 7, the principle of implementation. And from my understanding of Gregor and Jones, it's not design principle because that's component number 3, but more the method and a way to strengthen, to enhance your ISDT. So well, my first comment will be how do you take into account this last step, remaining step in the ISDT component framework? How do you describe the process, the method for implementing your product of theorizing? And the second, I think it was one of the weak points of the paper or related to the complex domain. So it was in the title, complexity, complex domain. You only mention it page 2 when you say digitalization is a complex phenomenon, but we are waiting for more definition of what's a complexity. But I think you took that into account in the presentation, and maybe this will also feed the next iteration of the paper. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Jean-Luc. Do you want to respond, Kasia, briefly before we open up for question and answers?
Sure. Thank you so much, Jean-Luc, for your comments and also for the review. It was really helpful, and I definitely agree with you with all the things you mentioned here. So I try to answer on your questions. So the 7th component from Gregor and Jones, the principles of implementation, this is one of the non-mandatory components of their theory, which is why we did not yet focus, completely on that part. But we know that this definitely should be done. But we think that this applies at the moment when the artifacts are instantiated. So when the maturity model artifact will be transformed into a model and then applied in a company. So we think since this is not yet part of the theory, we somehow neglected it here. But yeah, this you're right. We will focus on this. And the second comment, the complexity, that's true. We took this the argument of complexity for the implementation of the configurational theory, because configurational theory or the methods are able to somehow investigate complexity. And we argued that digital transformation is a complex phenomenon and that there are so many influencing factors that we somehow combined this complexity approach with configurational theory. But I will take this into consideration when we somehow work on the paper again, revise it. And the configurational theory part, the last comment is that we focused on the background from Regan, who developed this QCA method, and that is why we have these references when it comes to the configurational part. But I will definitely have a look into the reference that you mentioned here. So thank you very much for this.
Right, thank you, Kasia. So let's open up for Q&A. Anyone would like to ask Kasia or Jean-Luc any questions? And I have some comments as well, but I'll just leave it to the audience first before we go on to my comments. So anyone have any questions? Nope. All right, let me just say a few things while others are thinking about it. When I think Kasia, when she submitted abstract and she received the editorial comments about her abstract, and then when we received her work in progress paper, she took into consideration some of those comments, which of course the comments are saying, well, this, especially if it's not about theories, it's about products of theorizing. So you should not foreground the theory, put it in the background, and then focus on the products of theorizing, which I think I've already discussed a few times before. So and I think that's partly the reason why you're struggling with trying to define which is which, because it's kind of started backwards. You know, you're starting with the theory, a design theory perhaps, a configurational theory for the design theory and so on. And now you're going backwards to trying to figure out, oh, wait a minute, which one is this? Is the product of theorizing we're supposed to focus on? So naturally, if you had begun with the product of theorizing in the first place, that would have been probably a more natural approach, because there wouldn't be any discussion of theories per se, if you know what I mean. So because you're kind of going backwards, that's partly the reason I think you're trying to figure out, okay, which part of this whole discussion is the product that we should be focusing on, which is the goal of this special issue, right? So, let me give you an example of a model, and then maybe we can go from there. So, an example of a maturity model is like the example of a ladder, right? So there are a lot of maturity models actually follow a ladder-like model, and the understanding behind that model is that as you go up the ladder, you are more complete, if you will, or you've reached your goal as you go further up the model. So that's one kind of model for assessing maturity. It may be the only model. I don't know if there is a different model. Maybe there's a spiral model that we can use for maturity. Maybe there is a punctuation model that we can use for maturity. I don't know. That is something that, you know, what perhaps you could be discussing when it comes to trying to figure out, okay, what kind of model will work best with trying to figure out the maturity of this phenomenon that we're looking at. So that's what I meant, or that's what, you know, perhaps what we are looking at when we're trying to figure out what model fits best, because that's the product of theorizing that we're trying to, you know, theorize, essentially. That's the product of theorizing we're trying to develop. Now, what it will come out in the end, we don't know yet. What that theory will develop into is something that, you know, hopefully we will develop a complete theory at the end. But the focus right now is at that level where, okay, we're looking at models right now. That's what we're looking at. So that, you know, I guess dispenses your worry about, okay, what are we looking at, right? Because you focus, you don't have to split it. You don't have to carve it. There's no issue of carving it at all. It doesn't come into the picture now, because now you started with the product and you go on from there. Now, could there be a possibility that the model might incorporate a different concept? Yes, of course. So you started working with this model and you figure out, for example, this model doesn't work because it's missing something. And that's when you bring in some other products of theorizing to help you to develop further the model that you are developing. So usually in the case of theorizing, models tend to be the later part of the development in terms of theorizing, because in some theories, they consider models to be theories, especially if the model is tested. So when a model is tested and it passes the test, that's a theory, for example. So models tend to be the kind of the final stage, I guess, of theorizing. Whereas if you are trying to investigate your phenomenon more fully, maybe you can start with the other products of theorizing first. What is it that you're trying to, what questions are you trying to answer here? You know, are there some myths that you're trying to debunk when it comes to maturity? Okay, we've been holding on to maturity for so long. Is it really useful? So you see where I'm going here. So those things are the ones that we're trying to investigate. And then when you've gone through those early products of theorizing, you suddenly realize epiphany hits you and says, whoa, for the past 20 years, we've been going down the wrong road. See, that's a useful insight and something new that we can bring to the plate, rather than going backwards with the theory and trying to figure out how to break it apart.
Okay,
I
see.
don't know if that makes sense, but
yes, it makes sense, definitely.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gacha. All right, so let's go on to Tian, who has the final paper, but not obviously not the least, on the question of inertial mechanisms.
Right. So. Okay, so thank you. So in this work, I'm trying to introduce two new concepts, namely the location of inertia